But now we are on to a totally different topic, but also someone who can speak to very specific use cases and applications of location intelligence. So Dan Cookson is an independent housing consultant, housing analyst,
Sure.
and kind of is wearing two hats for this. He's going to talk a lot about sort of like the business implications of what's happening, specifically what's happening in the European market and the UK in particular. UK?
Scotland.
Scotland, excuse me. I think technically
And
I'm
and
Scottish.
a bit of London, a bit of Dublin.
Yeah, I think Scottish. I think Ian is actually Scottish anyway, so I should know this better. But what's happening to the housing market as a function of that, and he's done a lot of work. I think in his words, he was sort of a GIS junkie back in the day who kind of lost track of it, and then started using CARTO a few years ago, and kind of now is really doubled down on what he's doing with spatial analytics around the housing market. So really interesting stuff, and if you follow him on Twitter, you'll see a lot of the cool maps that he's built that show up in a lot of places because they pop up in my Twitter feed all the time. So. Let me shut up now and hand it over to Dan. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you very much, Ian, and hello. It's absolutely delightful to be here in Madrid. I need to know clicker, though. I haven't actually got my head around the technology. What do we got? Yeah. How spatial analysis will determine the future of Airbnb. That's a big, big title. I'm not quite sure I'm going to be able to deliver on the expectations there. It's simple, catchy, bold, and full of certainty. We know that the futures aren't quite like that. Messy, complicated, nuanced, and full of uncertainty. But what I'm going to hopefully show is how spatial analysis can actually help us get some insights into what's happening. I'm going to really talk about my specific research into Airbnb in Scotland, impacts on cities there, especially Edinburgh, and get a sense of how these kind of tools can help cities respond to those impacts, which are both positive and negative. A little bit about me. Ian gave us a very brief synopsis. Way back in the day, I actually trained as an architect. I didn't practice. I moved. There was a huge recession. There wasn't any work, and I thought I wasn't going to be any good at it. So I ended up getting into business research. I discovered GIS way back in '95. I was freelancing at the time and thought I need to be able to do snazzy things with maps. Bought a license for Map Info V3. It was for the Mac. I think it was the first or the last time they actually produced anything for a Mac. But I figured it out, and produced maps, which I thought was absolutely amazing. From that, somebody actually asked me to lecture a course at the local university because I was a chapter ahead of the students, and you learn by teaching. Then specialized in housing market data. I was based in Scotland, ended up with a government agency called Scottish Homes, who were doing really great things with data and mapping software, GIS in particular, huge investment there. I came along with my little bit of information or ability with Map Info, which could actually trump what they were doing. And through that, they changed their systems. Also discovered the web. Was a very early adopter of something called Autodesk Map Guide, which was allowing you to distribute GIS through an Internet Explorer with an ActiveX plugin. That was a very interesting journey. As it happened, a little sort of story about that. Ed Parsons was the main man at Autodesk at the time. He went on to head up technology at Ordnance Survey, and then got poached by Google. So he's their sort of chief geotechnologist. But it was a smart bit of software, and I learned a lot. Left that agency to set up my own consultancy with some technical help. I'm not a coder. So I needed help in that respect, but I do understand data and policy, especially around housing. Another aside, I set up a business called myhouseprice.com in 2002, which was the first to actually license data from the land registry and get it onto the web so the general public could actually access house price information. This was before the portals, the property portals were around and just giving it away. We charged a sort of £1 to find out. But it was the start of that journey to actually get that data out into the general public. So that's a little bit about me. Moving on to what you're here to hear about. Well, as Ian said, I had been doing GIS. I came back to it more recently when I needed to have a tool to visualize information quickly. Discovered CARTO in about 2014 and was immediately excited by the potential, and I've been using it ever since. Absolutely passionate about open data visualization, obviously, mapping, and the key part of this is sharing it, getting it into people's faces who don't otherwise think about data spatially. There's a huge world out there of people that are scared of data, don't understand it, but if you can present it clearly on a map, they engage, which is really, really powerful. So that's a bit of setting a scene, a bit of context. We're going to move on to sort of Airbnb. The context, I do a lot of work in Edinburgh. It's got a fast-growing population. It's got huge inflows of visitors every year for the festival. Their tourist season is extending to the year-round. There's pressures on the housing market, on the rental market, and the government wanted to have a look at it. So they actually got in touch with me because they knew I knew where to go to start finding out these things. These issues are absolutely fundamentally spatial, so that was the approach. It was to get the data and start exploring. So I'm going to quickly move on. A bit of background. I mentioned tourist city. It's growing. Edinburgh Airport, 13 million last year. The highest numbers ever. Population's about 530,000. So obviously a lot smaller than Madrid, but it's a small city. And each year, because of the festival, they have about 4 million people coming. Now that's a festival that's not just in the summer, it's spreading out across the year. There's a number of festivals, but they're very proud to be the festival city. But that comes with pressures about where people stay. In 2015, Airbnb were announced as official accommodation partner. So that was at a time when Airbnb were growing fast. And as I mentioned, there's a pressure on the housing market with a growing population as well. So there are issues, and that means rising rents and problems for people looking to live in the city. So while Edinburgh is the focus, the research covered Scotland as a whole. That's a screen grab from the map interface that I built as part of this research, which you'll be able to access yourselves in a moment. And I'm just going to, that's the URL that I'm going to visit. So if you want to just visit that, you're free to. I'll just quickly go to some screen grabs which summarize some of the sort of key themes. This is, again, a static image, but it's highlighting a timeline. It's using talk, CARTO's excellent animation, which has always been a really powerful way of visualizing data over time. A highlight here is Glasgow 2014, the Commonwealth Games, which was a big deal for Glasgow. And in that particular month, which is July 2014, there was a huge sort of rush of activity, which is only visible when you actually look at the data on in an animated way. Edinburgh always has its sort of July, which is sort of a constant sort of heartbeat, and you'll see that in the animation. But even if there are other events like the Open at St Andrews, that's every 5 years, but it's a really big deal. I happen to live in that little spot in the middle called Cooper, which is the town sort of 9 miles from St Andrews. But that's the home of golf. It attracts a lot of people every 5 years. And again, that gets picked up through the animation. Other ways of presenting that information, obviously dot maps showing price. That's relatively standard stuff. But it's that layering of information that is so powerful, that ability to look at data in relation to other data. That thematic map beneath is basically looking at PRS, private rented sector, the percentage of households in the PRS. The darker the shade, the more private rented sector. So rental sector tends to be high in city centres, and that's particularly where the pressures are with respect to Airbnb. But you can also look at the rural. Being spatial, we pulled in the urban-rural definitions from the government. So these are boundaries, and it's very simple to quickly run that query against their specific geographies, their boundaries, to run the analysis and report on it. So it's not all about just visual. The research included qualitative work, interviewing a whole range of stakeholders. But that ability to quickly process and visualize the information was key in many parts of the research. The clustering, another sort of standard feature of CARTO, quickly visualizing numbers, in a way that is, again, interactive if you zoom in. So what I'll do, if I can actually go back to if I can go to the live map, which I've got up on screen, that would be really handy. Can you flick over to the laptop? Possibly? Do I have to do anything? Oh, yay. Okay. So if you followed that URL, you'll be able to see that on your phone or device. And what that is doing is obviously summarizing a lot of new listings on Airbnb over time. So if I'll just highlight, we'll zoom in on, let's zoom in on Edinburgh. Okay. And this is what really impresses, the fact that it's not just a dumb video, it's actually an interactive display that's, varies at scale. Hearing from the team at CARTO about what's coming down the pipe is amazing. Doing this, a vector approach to this, or doing it with polygons would be fascinating. But again, this kind of animated approach is really good to grab people's attention. You then get them to actually interact with the map, turn the animation off, and actually look at, say, entire properties that are on Airbnb. Because there's no issues with shared accommodation. It's when mainstream rental stock moves into something for tourists. You're losing accommodation in the mainstream housing. And that's something that's we're trying to quantify. Because it might not be an issue, it might be. The suggestions are that exponential growth is leading to some pressures, but only in particular areas. And those areas tend to be city centre, old town, and new town. And again, color is representing the price. I could click on that and link to a picture. For some reason, that's not showing the picture, but you get the idea. So very quickly, sharing that really opened up what the issues were to a lot of people. And I find that's one of the key strengths of CARTO, is that ability to share interactivity, location intelligence to people that just otherwise wouldn't have thought about it. And if you are going to visit that site, there's just I'll turn off that layer. We could have a look at the clustering. It is just so intuitive and so fast that it is giving real insights into people that just wouldn't consider accessing this information through a GIS system themselves. And that's exciting. And other layers like hotels. You can pull that together very quickly, and as a sort of consultant researcher, I'm not building necessarily a system for a permanent use. This is drawn together for a very specific project. It still exists, and it's still actually getting quite a bit of traffic because it's shared. And I'll just show, maybe I've got the link, maybe not. If I can go back to the presentation. Yeah, this is an example. Ferret is a sort of Scottish digital journalist group that write up various stories. They do a good job. They got in touch because they were very interested in the subject, and asked if they could use the map. I said, of course you can. Shared the embed code. So that map we've been exploring sits within their publication. And it's another route to sharing that insight. This Andy Whiteman, MSP, is a Scottish parliamentarian, very well respected for the Green Party. He's an expert in sort of geography, land ownership. He's actually campaigning. I'm the researcher consultant that tries to find the middle path. He's on the other side. He's the politician trying to get policies to be changed. But he's been using this to help them understand. He's been using the map to understand what's going on, and that becomes a very powerful tool. And a lot of it's happening through Twitter and social media. I know I'm at a CARTO conference, but this is a Tableau interface. When CARTO gets their charting, I'm looking forward to seeing that because I'll be using it. But in the meantime, I'm using other tools. Tableau, I know it's a sort of closed environment, and the open source guys don't like it, but I find it very powerful to quickly build dashboards and get some quite nice sort of charting interfaces. And in essence, that's back to the Airbnb in Edinburgh, actually. That top chart is showing sort of new listings, and at the bottom chart, you're getting a sense of the cumulative count of active listings. So Edinburgh's actually got about just under 9,000 active listings at the moment. Is that significant? It probably is. As a proportion of the population, it's a lot higher than London's. At which point, I go back to the laptop, because I'll show you London. Same idea, just again, using CARTO Talk to visualize, animate that new listings coming onto Airbnb over time. What I should say is the source for that is inside Airbnb. Now that's a guy, Murray Cox, based in New York, an Australian, who's a thorn in the side of Airbnb. He's a community activist, but I'll show you his site. He basically scrapes Airbnb and hosts the data. So you can go in, download the data for a city, and he does a pretty good job of displaying that, even on his own site. But it's not as sophisticated as you can get with obviously CARTO. I actually get bottom right there. I actually get a hat tip there because I got in touch with him before this was released. I've been telling him that Edinburgh needed this data. I'm not that technical, but I knew he could do it, so we sort of collaborated. He scraped it, let me know when he did it. I told him what neighborhood boundaries to use, so that when he publishes at neighborhood level, they're the same as the official neighborhood boundaries, so that we've actually got some useful geographies there that are consistent with the way the council think about the city. The council are accessing this data as well, so it was a useful precursor to them actually getting their heads around what was happening in the city. So I showed London, Dublin in green, obviously, but same idea. You know, it's a pattern we're seeing a lot, and I could repeat this across Europe. The challenge, obviously, for cities is what to do, and policy on this is complicated. Cities need tourists, obviously. People want to live in the cities as well, so there's tensions there, and how that plays out is still to be determined. But what I would say is that through these kind of tools, there's going to be a hell of a lot better understanding of what's going on by a lot more people. So the location component, the location analysis that is available to everybody now, potentially, is going to change, I think, how Airbnb deliver and how they respond, or how cities respond to that. We'll just go back to the presentation. So I've shown you Dublin, London, and UK. Those are some screen grabs. And at that point, I've reached the end. And I'm